It's okay. I can walk a bit, can't I? I'm allowed a little bit of movement. Thank you for having me. It's a real privilege to come and speak to you from the Bible this morning. I should have checked with Phil what translation you use. I see you use the NIV and I'm using the ESV. So, okay, amazing. But I've got NIV here, so I'll just try and connect him with any little contrasts. Yeah, it's great to be with you this morning. We're from King's Church, so we are part of the New Ground family of churches, and we, during COVID, kind of transitioned for us quite significantly from being one church meeting in Kingston itself to being one church with two congregations, one in New Malden in the afternoon and one at Thames Ditton just down the road in the morning. So COVID kind of, God really spoke to us through that season and reset us in quite a significant way. We've just bought that building in Thames Ditton, which is a church we've been thinking and praying about for many, many years. Not a dissimilar building actually to this, kind of really intimate, beautiful sanctuary space. I've just brought a couple of friends from church with me, Becca and Emeka, who are part of our church as well, one at each venue. They've been praying for you guys this week, and we're just praying this would be a real blessing to you. I know they would love to be able to pray for you if you're up for that towards the end, and I know they'd love to hear from God and potentially bring anything that God might be saying to us corporately or individually this morning so that we can really know him better and be changed by him. I'm just going to get straight into the text this morning that Phil has given me, which is in Luke chapter 15. We're in the middle of Lent, or in the season of Lent, aren't we? As we approach Easter. Lent is this wonderful season that helps us to approach Easter with a sense of worship and a sense of anticipation, and also to understand more and more what does it actually mean to follow this incredible God-man who was crucified and rose at Easter. We don't want to be just followers of Jesus who come to meetings about Jesus or know stuff about Jesus, but actually learn to follow him, to become like him, to develop a character like him, to share the message that he gave us to share, and to teach others how to follow him. That's what a disciple is, right? And I know Phil and Heather are passionate that this season would be not just a season of worship and reminding ourselves who God is, but also reminding ourselves what it means to follow Christ with our heart, our soul, our body, and our mind. And so this is the text that Phil has chosen. You might be familiar with it if you've been in church or in the Bible any time at all. Some people know it as the story of the prodigal son. It's probably best described really as the story of a father and two sons. In fact, that's how Jesus introduced it. He said it was a story of a father and two sons, and that's how we'll be looking at it this morning. Charles Dickens, who knew a thing or two about telling short stories, he said this was the greatest short story ever told. Something about it obviously clearly moved him and spoke to him quite profoundly. So let's get into this text. I'm going to read, as Heather said, from the ESV. There's just a few little translation points that might be different in the NIV. Okay, here we go. And he, Jesus, said, "There was a man who had two sons. And the younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me.'" Just a quick point on that. For us, we probably think of that as being, well, that's a bit rude to ask for your inheritance early. We need to understand that in the first century Middle East, this is more than just a bit rude. This is outrageous. This would have brought enormous shame on the family and the community for a son to essentially wish his father to be dead and grasp the inheritance before his time was an outrageous thing to do. So we sort of raise our eyebrows maybe. Jesus' original audience are already shocked about this story. Let's carry on. "And he, the father, divided his property between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country, and there he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything." Again, just worth pausing, especially if you know this story well. Here you've got this young man. He's brought indescribable shame on his family. He's now destitute. He's homeless. He's starving. And as a young Jewish man, he's utterly humiliated because he's living with and serving amongst pigs. This is about as bleak as it gets. Verse 17. "But when he came to himself, he said, How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Just treat me as one of your hired servants. And he arose and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, bring quickly the best robe, put it on him, put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring the fattened calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to celebrate. Now, his oldest son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. And he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he said to him, your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he's received him back safe and sound. But he was angry and refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him, or pleaded with him. But he answered his father, look, these many years I have served you. I've never disobeyed your command, yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him. And he said to him, son, you're always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. So Charles Dickens said this was the greatest short story ever told. But interestingly, the people who heard it, who were religious people, religious leaders in the first century Middle East, they effectively thought it was the worst story ever told. They hated stories like this. Think about it, because of these kinds of stories and this kind of teaching, they killed Jesus for this kind of stuff. And so on the one hand, you've got Charles Dickens saying this is the greatest story ever been told, and you've got people hearing it at the time hating it. And I guess the question is why? And I think actually it's kind of the same answer. I think both sets of people have understood the central message of the story. And depending on where your heart is at, and depending on how you choose to respond to the story, it either becomes one of the greatest stories you've ever told, or it actually becomes quite challenging and even offensive. And I guess my encouragement to you this morning would be just to let this text be more than maybe a familiar story that you've heard before, if you have. And let it actually really work on your heart as it's worked on mine this week. Let it challenge you, let it affect you, and let God the Father really speak to you through it, that he might bring you into something really beautiful and fresh and transformative this morning. That's been my prayer this week. Here's the big idea. If you hear one thing this morning, hear this from this text. God is a father who runs towards those who run from him. That's the big idea of the message. That, I think, is what both the Pharisees at the time and perhaps even Charles Dickens have understood. God is a father who runs towards those who run from him. Let's just unpack that little statement together, and then we'll respond towards the end. God is a father. I appreciate it's Mother's Day this morning, and we've already mentioned it and celebrated it, and I'm sure many of us will be celebrating that in different ways today. And God is not male, but he reveals himself as a father. Phil led us in that prayer that Jesus taught us. When Jesus was asked, how do we talk to God? Jesus said like this, our Father. It's absolutely central. And for the Pharisees of Jesus' day, that was not how they particularly wanted to understand and relate to God. He was holy, transcendent, other, and Jesus reveals him to be this tender, beautiful Father. That was quite presumptuous, even shocking to his original listeners. Maybe for Charles Dickens, it was part of the reason why it was the most wonderful story ever told. For some of you this morning, that's maybe all you need to hear this morning. God is Father, and he's good, and he's always good, and he's only good. Secondly, God is a father who runs. Did you notice that part of the story? He runs towards this recalcitrant younger brother who begins to return back home. And again, maybe we think, oh, this is a nice moment. It's nice. The younger son has had a bit of a shocker for a few years, and now he's going to come back home, and the father comes and says, again, for these Jesus original listeners, these Jewish religious leaders, they're already shocked. They're shocked that this father in the story hasn't written the younger son out of the family, erased him forever. That's what should happen, given the shame he's brought on them. Then they're even more shocked that this father would be running towards him. And just as an aside, did you notice that it said that the father saw him when he was a long way off? Which must tell us, I think, that he'd been watching out for him. I like to think this father had been there day after day after day, scanning the horizon, watching, waiting for his much-loved younger son to come to his senses and to come home. But he runs. And again, when we think, oh, that's nice. That's what I would do if I saw my son. I would run to him. That's not what kind of father figures, patriarchal figures in an esteemed familial community do in the first century Middle East. One scholar, New Testament scholar, said this: traditional Middle Easterners wearing long robes do not run in public. They never have. To do so would be deeply humiliating. And so you've got this moment where this father has been watching out, perhaps for days, weeks, years, I don't know, for this young son to come home. And as he appears across the horizon, he doesn't fold his arms and wait. He runs, he gathers up his robes. He does something that's culturally almost outrageous and runs to this son. God is a father who runs to those who run to him. He's overwhelmed with compassion. Let me just tell you a short story that might help illustrate this a little bit. When I was 7 or 8, we went on a family holiday, as we often did, to Devon. And we were on the beach in Devon. Any Devon holiday makers here? Okay, 1 or 2. So you can kind of imagine the scene. And my dad has said to me, you can paddle around, Philip, in the sea, but just beware that as you go out a few meters, the sand, the beach, shelves away quite suddenly. I obviously wasn't much of a swimmer because he's a bit concerned for me. He said, just don't go out too far, because very suddenly the sand will just drop and you'll be out of your depth. So what did I do? I used my freedom and choice that my father had gave me to ignore those instructions and to paddle out way further than the bit of sea we talked about. And I can still remember, as a little boy, that feeling of, whoo! Suddenly, the sand beneath my feet disappears. I'm in water that's higher than me. I can't stand up. I can remember that sense of panic. Clearly, I wasn't much of a swimmer because I'm starting to sort of panic and splash around, and the water's bubbling up into your mouth and into your nose, and it was really beginning to be quite distressing. And I can remember this moment, genuinely, of looking out across the beach and seeing my dad, who I think at the time was reading the paper. But he looked up, and I remember just catching his eye as I was kind of flailing around in the water, and him seeing me. And what do you think he did at that moment? Do you think he folded his arms and said to my mum, "Told you. Well, I warned him. I gave him some very clear instructions for his good. I guess he's now going to just have to pay the penalty of his disobedience." No. He leapt up and he ran across the beach. If he'd have had one of those Baywatch orange little buoyancy aids, it would have been the perfect scene. I was like, man, my dad can really shift. And he ran across the beach. He dived into the water. I can remember his arm coming up underneath my chin, and he dragged me back onto the sand, and I was deposited unceremoniously on the sand, spluttering and teary, but relieved, rescued, safe, secure, knowing the embrace of my father, who hadn't watched and waited for me to sort myself out, but had come to get me. And do you know what else? I remember he did say to me when we got home, something along the lines of, "Philip, when I give you commands, boundaries that are for your good, I want you to obey them." But actually, my overriding experience when we got home was of celebration. My mum and dad ordered in fish and chips, which when you were 7, 8 years old is just a dream. We had fish and chips, and we just celebrated. He didn't say my son was lost and now is found, but he might as well have done. And we just celebrated, and we kind of worked through the afternoon, and lots of tears as you process what you've been through, and we had fish and chips and stayed up late, and it was amazing. It was amazing. I can still remember it now. Joy, celebration. I wasn't just rescued and then told to sort myself out. You can sit in the corner, little boy. You've been naughty. You stay here, and tomorrow when you've cleaned yourself up and well behaved, then you can come in. No, come in now. Fish and chips for you, celebration for you. Come and enjoy all of the family home. I had 2 brothers and a sister, and we all celebrated together. And I reckon I had the most fish and chips of all. God is a father who runs to those who run from him. And I get it. We all have different experiences of fathers, some great, some not so great. And I get that, and that's a whole thing for many of us. I just want to put before you as best I can the kind of father that God is. He's a good one who runs to those who run from him. You see, there are many ways to run from God. And I guess the younger son, his way is one way, isn't it? He just throws off all moral boundaries. He throws off any sense of authority. He refuses to wait on God's boundaries and timing. I guess he thinks that true happiness, true fulfillment lies in discovering his own truth. I guess that's kind of what he's thinking. I think the lie he believes is that happiness, pleasure, and joy and satisfaction has to lie outside of the healthy boundaries of God. I think that's what he must be believing. And I'm guessing he probably had a cracking time along the way. Let's be real. He probably had a great time at moments. But ultimately, he comes to the end of himself. It's utterly empty. Here's what Russell Brand, the comedian, said. Here is a postcard from the other side. Fame, luxury items and glamour are not real and cannot solve you. Whether it is a pair of shoes or a stream of orgies. A movie career or a moment of adulation at work. They are just passing clouds of imaginary pleasure. I think that's helpful. Someone who's given himself fully to what reckless living can look like. He's saying, listen, whether you go with me like to the full end of the spectrum, or whether you're just dipping your toe, actually, if that's what you're looking for, it's just empty. It's imaginary, ultimately, he's saying. I don't know whether many of us here are engaging in orgies in the week. Might be. Church needs to be a place for anyone and everyone. But I bet that some of us will regularly experience that same lie the younger son must have heard, which is pleasure, satisfaction, joy, what you really want lies outside of God's healthy boundaries. Or waiting on his timing, as the younger son refused to do. That's not feel good. You don't want to wait any longer. Take things into your own hands. If you're anything like me, all of us have heard that little voice. So just because you haven't engaged in the younger son's crazy, wild living doesn't mean that we're not just sometimes stepping into that same space. But God is a father who runs towards those who run from him. But there's another way, isn't there? There's another way to run from God. It's a bit more subtle. It's the older son's way. It's the older son. And I guess you could say it like this. If the younger son runs from God by being really bad, quote unquote, the older son runs from God by being really good. Because he's the one that's done all the right things in life, isn't he? He's the really well-behaved guy, the responsible guy. He's done all the right things, obeyed his father, done the right stuff. In contemporary terms, maybe he's paid his taxes, he's raised good kids, he's paid off his mortgage, he's worked hard, he's doing the right thing. But he's far from his father. His heart is. How do we know that? Because of the way he responds to the grace that's given to his younger son. When he learns that his reprobate younger brother is being given this extravagant welcome, he is furious. Did you hear that in the text? He basically says, you never did anything for me. And I've served you, and I've obeyed you all these years, Father. You see, Jesus knew, and this is why the Pharisees hated this story, That's why some of us get a bit challenged by this story. I do. Jesus knew that there's a certain type of person who thinks that by living a good life, a morally respectable life, a religious life, that actually by doing that, life should kind of owe us and God should owe us. And they're often found in churches. They're often found doing this sort of thing. We can slip into a space where we think, well, I'm attending the right meetings. I'm avoiding the obvious sins. I'm giving an amount of money. I'm giving my time. I'm doing this, this, and this. And frankly, God should owe me accordingly. It can slip into our thinking. But look at the Father. Did you see his response? Remember, God is a Father who runs to those who run from him. And the Father kind of runs to this older son. It says in the text, he entreated him. I think in the NIV it says pleaded with him. What does he call him? Son. It's the same attitude. He's basically saying, oh son, don't stay here in the cold in your self-righteousness. Come in and celebrate. This is for you, this party, this celebration, this inheritance. It's for you. But if you stay here in your self-righteousness, thinking that your obedience, your moralism, your religious efforts are going to earn you anything, you're going to stay here. And that's the sobering part of this story. We don't know the older son's response. Jesus is a very clever storyteller. He closes the story and he leaves us wondering, but what happened to the older son? And of course the religious leaders listening to this story, they can very well understand the point. Because that's who he's speaking to. It's a sobering moment that Jesus ends on. You see, just for what it's worth, my observation from my own life, and I guess I alluded to it a bit earlier, is this. I kind of feel like I've believed both lies that the younger son and the older son choose to believe in my time. I've been that younger son. I said to God, and prior to that, you do what you want, I'll do what I want. I've given myself to some reckless living in the past, in younger days. And it's great at times. It's great. But ultimately, after a while, it's just empty. It's like being in a pigsty. It really is. I believe the lie that living within God's boundaries, obeying him, waiting on his timing, is not where satisfaction and happiness is to be found. And then I come to the end of myself. That's what happened to me. I was at that church I alluded to before, St. George's in Ashted, with my friend Matt, just sat at the back thinking, yep, I just at the end of myself. I need to come back to God. I need to humble myself. I need to confess my sin. I need to realize my need of him. I need to let him be God and me be me, not the other way around. And I found a Father that runs to me. And I've also found the other way as well. I've also been in that space where I've been that older son, and I've thought, if I can just do the right thing, work hard enough, be well behaved, be impressively righteous and moral, preach enough good sermons, lead a church well enough, all that stuff that is particularly vulnerable for us church leaders to step into, if I can just do that, God will owe me. Life will owe me. And maybe what I'm really wanting as I'm doing that is life to go as I want, not God. Maybe what I'm really wanting is people to respect me, not God. Think about the older son is, he doesn't ultimately want the Father, he wants what the Father can give him. And yet what the Father offers to him is so beautiful and wonderful. What he offers to us is so wonderful. His invitation to all of us this morning, wherever we're at, is come home. Come home. God is a Father who runs towards those who run from him. You're loved. As Heather said, you really, really are. Look at the cost that this Father has paid, if you're a Christian today, to welcome you into his family. Sends Jesus at enormous cost to bring us home. In fact, you could say Jesus is the perfect older brother, the opposite of this older brother in the story, the opposite of sometimes our older brother's spirit. Hebrews 2:11 says, Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers. He says, I will declare your name to my brothers. Jesus is many things, including our elder brother, and he's the perfect one. He comes to earth. He obeys his Father perfectly for all the right reasons, with a pure heart, never disobeys him. He has the right to all that the Father owns, the riches of heaven. And instead he leaves it behind. And he comes to us and he seeks us out and he finds us in our own different kinds of pigsties and he carries us home and he brings us home. He puts us into the Father's family, not to keep our head down in the corner, but with a ring and a robe and a wealth and a place in the Father's family as a co-heir alongside him, all at his expense. You're loved. You really, really are. So let's none of us stay anywhere other than in the celebratory, joyous presence of God. God is a Father who runs towards those who run from him.